It was the spring of 1938. The maps of Europe drawn up after World War I were still fresh. The established order attempted to preserve peace within the treaties, but the political and practical storms of the 1930s blurred these boundaries. One of the most dramatic events in Europe at that time occurred quietly, without serious fighting, but with consequences. Germany annexed Austria. This was no simple act. It was a combined political, constitutional, and military maneuver involving individuals, institutions, and broad masses of the population. It was this act that showed the world how vulnerable interwar treaties were and how quickly the map of Europe could change. The roots of the Anschluss. The idea of unifying Germany and Austria had a long history dating back to the 19th century and nationalist notions of a German nation, which would include Austria. After World War I, this option was conditioned by the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which prohibited union with Germany. An independent Austria had entered into a new security management system, but by the 1930s, this prohibitive framework no longer reflected the sentiments of sections of Austrian society, particularly those who supported the idea of Heim in Reich, the return of the German lands to a unified state. Under this policy, Austria in 1934 was under the authoritarian regime of the Fatherland Front, which fought against the Austrian Nazis but was unable to completely suppress popular sentiments for unification. Why did Hitler decide to act? For Germany, Adolf Hitler's annexation of Austria simultaneously presented several practical and symbolic objectives. On the one hand, a political gain, the expansion of German space and support for nationalist policies. On the other, an economic and military one. Austria provided access to resources, banks, and industry, as well as to the Reich plan. Moreover, the Anschluss was politically advantageous. Many Austrians genuinely supported the idea of unification, which made the fact of Anschluss much easier to achieve than intensifying the invasion of the country with total resistance. A key resource here was the intelligence network. The Nazis had been preparing the ground in Austria for years, using local activists, propaganda, and constitutional pressure. The key figures in the Austrian drama of early March 1938 were Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg and the leader of the Austrian Nazis, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, as well as, of course, Hitler and the Nazi leadership. In late February and early March of 1938, tensions escalated. Schuschnigg, attempting to preserve independence, announced a referendum on Austrian independence. The plebiscite was scheduled for March 13, 1938. This decision was viewed by Berlin as an unacceptable provocation. In response to the free vote, Hitler issued an ultimatum: either victory through a plebiscite and the adoption of a government loyal to Germany, or Germany would intervene. Under international pressure and political pressure, Schuschnigg was forced to act. His resignation was announced on March 11, 1938. On the night of March 11th to 12th, the emergency led to the appointment of Seyss-Inquart as chancellor, the man who later formally invited German troops into the country. March 12 to 13, 1938. Troops, entry, and legal formalization. Early in the morning of March 12, 1938, Wehrmacht units crossed the Austrian border. Officers were instructed not to fire. The action was intended as a cultural and ceremonial demonstration of the return of the homeland. German troops advanced deeper into Austria, and by the evening of March 12th, control of the capital was established. The following day, March 13th, the formal law on the reunification of Austria with the German Reich was adopted, a legal act declaring Austria's annexation to Germany and abolishing the sovereignty of the Austrian state. This was a swift legal and administrative blow, something that had already de facto physically occurred. Popular reaction and the reality of the greetings. Historical sources show that most cities, especially Vienna, greeted the German troops with mass greetings, crowds with flags, jubilant scenes, applause for Hitler. Many contemporary eyewitnesses and archival footage captured mass celebrations, some genuine, some orchestrated and provoked by intensive propaganda in the presence of party activists. However, these images don't tell the whole truth. Simultaneously with the triumph, arrests of opposition figures, persecution of Jews and political opponents, and the beginning of punitive and purifying actions, which soon became systemic. In other words, celebrations coexisted with repression, and this duality is crucial for understanding what happened. What we see in the footage is not all of Austria. It is carefully selected footage, shot by both German and Austrian cameramen supporting them. Here are a few key facts that significantly change the picture. According to the data, approximately a third of the population genuinely supported unification, another third was indifferent or confused, and only a third opposed it. In some parts of Austria, the Germans were greeted coldly, especially in the rural regions of Carinthia, Tyrol, and Styria. There, support for the Nazis was noticeably lower, and newsreels depict far less crowded scenes, but these very images were almost never included in official German films. But religious communities, some intellectuals, and prominent politicians were in mourning. The Catholic Church did not openly support the annexation. Many university professors resigned or left. Some military officials secretly discussed escape. The Anschluss is not just footage of happy crowds. What was captured on newsreels was a carefully curated showcase designed to show the world that Austria voluntarily became part of the Reich. The plebiscite of April 10, 1938. The legitimization stage? A month later, on April 10, 1938, a plebiscite was held in the United Reich. According to official German data, 99.7% voted for reunification, with a turnout of approximately 99.7%. In Austria, the official figure was 99.71%. These figures are now considered a farce by historians. The vote was conducted under occupation. Many categories of the population were excluded from the lists, primarily Jews and political opponents, and the ballots were designed and presented in an atmosphere of coercion and propaganda. The plebiscite was not so much a matter of free will as an instrument of post-coercive legitimization of an act already committed. International reaction, words instead of action. The international community responded primarily with verbal protests. A key factor was the policy of appeasement, which dominated in London and Paris at the time. Western states did not want armed conflict and did not take any real military steps to restore Austrian independence. Italy, previously unsatisfied with German expansion, also softened its position and effectively gave Hitler the green light for Austria's maneuver, thereby removing the main obstacle. International treaties, Versailles, Saint-Germain, legally prohibited the Anschluss, but their enforcement proved impossible without direct military intervention, which never occurred. With immediate consequences for Austria, repression and the policy of Aryanization. After the Anschluss, a rapid Nazification policy began. State institutions were purged of unreliable personnel, political parties and independent institutions were suppressed, and Jews and other vulnerable groups were subjected to discrimination, forced arrests, and the loss of their businesses and property. The concept of Aryanization, the transfer of Jewish property to Germans, became widespread practice. Many Jews and political dissidents attempted to flee, emigrated, and some soon ended up in concentration camps. These processes began immediately and became part of Nazi Germany's broader policy of treating the subjects of the new lands. The Anschluss was the first major step in Nazi Germany's aggressive foreign policy. It demonstrated that Hitler was able to change European borders without serious resistance from the great powers. Economically, Austria provided Germany with resources and banking reserves, and politically, it provided human resources and territorial reinforcements. This eventually became a gateway for further territorial claims, for example, the Sudetenland, and the atmosphere of impunity only strengthened Berlin's aggressive ambitions, which ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. Historical debates, voluntariness, and coercion. Historical scholarship debates the extent to which the mass support for the Anschluss was genuine, and how much was the result of propaganda and intimidation. Some modern studies emphasize that in the 1930s, a significant portion of Austrian society genuinely favored unification with Germany for cultural and economic reasons. Others emphasize that after the Nazis came to power, and especially after the introduction of repression, any expression of dissent was dangerous. History reveals a complex interplay of voluntary and coercive aspects, And it is important to remember that mass cheers on March 12th do not negate subsequent persecution and crimes, resources and organizations involved in the Anschluss. When we speak of the Anschluss, it's important to understand it wasn't simply a military operation or a sudden troop incursion. Nazi Germany employed a wide range of tools, from covert political decisions and pressure to a massive propaganda campaign. In fact, the Anschluss became a textbook example of a hybrid operation in which every Reich structure played its role. Germany began with diplomacy, or rather, diplomatic blackmail. Beginning in 1936, Reich diplomatic representatives constantly pressured the Austrian government, demanding that the activities of the National Socialist Party of Austria be legalized, restrictions on their press organs be lifted, and even that people loyal to Berlin be appointed to the government. The climax came on March 11, 1938, when Hitler sent Chancellor Schuschnigg a direct ultimatum. Either he hand over power to Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the leader of the Austrian Nazis, or Germany would ensure order militarily. At the same time, the German Foreign Ministry sent information notes to London, Paris, and Rome, ostensibly claiming that what was happening was an exclusively internal matter for Germany and Austria. This was done in advance, preventing anyone from even formally intervening. Remembrance and responsibility. After the war after 1945, Austria's role and responsibility in the wake of Nazi crimes became the subject of complex public and political debate. Initially, Austria positioned itself as the first victim of German aggression, which warranted special treatment from the Allies. However, researchers and human rights activists pointed to a wide range of complicity and active support for Nazi actions on the part of some Austrian citizens and institutions. Subsequently, public consciousness and historical scholarship began to work toward a more complex and honest understanding of the past. Recognition of victims and responsibility are an important part of post-war memory. The Anschluss of 1938 was more than just a single day of marching troops and triumphant crowds. It was a series of political steps, diplomatic pressure, organizational work within Austria, and the absence of a decisive response from outside. It demonstrates how a combination of propaganda, domestic support, and the threat of war can quickly change the borders and destinies of millions of people. The consequences were the destruction of an independent Austrian state, the persecution of Jews and political opponents, and a further escalation of aggression, culminating in a continental war. The history of the Anschluss is an important lesson about the fragility of international guarantees and how quickly freedom can be lost if it is not backed by strong institutions and a decisive international response.